Hello and welcome to the Playing Books podcast. It is great to have you here with us.
It's great to be back.
We are looking at a specific kind of power today. The kind of power that comes from being the only person in the room who's willing to say the thing that everyone else is thinking, but is just too polite or maybe too scared to voice.
Exactly. We're looking at the career of Mary Robinson, and we're doing it through her memoir, Everybody Matters, My Life-Giving Voice.
And it is a memoir, absolutely, but as I was reading it, I felt it was something more.
Oh, for sure. If you read it closely, it's almost like a manual.
Mm-hmm.
It functions as a blueprint on how to dismantle a system from the inside out, without losing your soul in the process.
That's the tricky part, isn't it? Keeping the soul intact while you're navigating the absolute highest halls of global power.
It is. We are talking about a journey that starts in a rainy, somewhat stifling town in the west of Ireland in the 1940s.
Right. And it ends up at the table with Nelson Mandela, with Jimmy Carter, and in front of the UN Security Council.
It's a massive arc. And I think what makes Everybody Matters such a compelling text, such a compelling read, is that Robinson doesn't present herself as this predestined hero.
No, not at all.
She isn't born a radical. She starts as a, frankly, very confused, somewhat repressed girl in Ballina, just trying to figure out why the rules of her society don't quite match the reality she sees out the car window.
So that's what we're going to do in this podcast. We're going to cover that entire arc. We'll look at those small places where her consciousness about rights really began.
Her time as a young legal crusader, really dismantling the patriarchy brick by brick.
And then the earthquake of her election as president of Ireland, and that final huge pivot to the global stage with the UN, and of course, the climate justice movement.
It's a lot to cover.
It is. But I want to start with the core thesis of the book, the title itself, Everybody Matters.
Yeah.
It sounds a bit like a greeting card slogan, doesn't it? It sounds a little bit nice, a little bit soft.
It does sound soft, but in practice, it is incredibly hard. I mean, it's a radical idea. And she borrows this concept from Eleanor Roosevelt to really explain this.
Okay.
Roosevelt asked, where do universal rights begin? And her answer was, in small places, close to home.
The factory floor, the neighborhood school.
The kitchen table, exactly. And Robinson's point is that everybody matters is not a passive statement. It's a political stance. It's a radical political stance.
So if rights don't function in your local town, they don't really function anywhere.
That's it. It's the idea that human rights aren't these abstract things floating around in the ether at The Hague. They're the interactions you have with your neighbor, with your boss, with your family.
And if you look at Robinson's career, every major move she makes is, in a way, an attempt to apply that small place logic to a bigger and bigger stage.
Precisely. She starts with the small place of Ballina, then the slightly bigger but still small place of the Irish legal system, and eventually the planet itself becomes the small place she's trying to fix.
So, okay, let's go there. Let's go to the original small place. We're going back to the 1940s and 50s. Ballina, County Mayo.
On the western periphery of Europe. And you're right, to understand her, you have to understand the specific texture of that town.
It wasn't just a small town. It was a place defined by a very, very rigid class structure.
Absolutely. You had the crumbling remains of the Anglo-Irish gentry in the big houses.
The ascendancy.
The ascendancy, exactly.
Right.
Then you had the rising Catholic middle class, the professionals. And then you had widespread, just grinding poverty.
And Mary Robinson, or Mary Burke, as she was then, she's in this very specific, slightly awkward position. Her parents, Aubrey and Tessa, were both doctors.
Which in 1950s, Ireland is, that's essentially local royalty. It
Oh.
was. They had a large house, they had a car when very few others did, and they were the medical authority for the whole region. But, and this is crucial, because they were doctors before universal health care, Mary had this front row seat to the poverty of the region.
This is a huge point in the book. She wasn't reading about inequality in some Dickens novel.
No.
She was riding in the back of her father's car while he did house calls.
She describes going into these cottages that had no running water, no electricity, families living in a single room, earthen floors, and she talks about the silence around tuberculosis.
The silence is key, isn't it?
It's so key. TB was this whisper in the room because it was associated with poverty and squalor. It was a sign of failure somehow.
So she sees this misery up close. But then she goes back to her big house with the servants and the velvet curtains.
And that creates a psychological friction. She calls it being an insider-outsider. She was inside the privilege, but she felt completely outside the comfort of it. It didn't sit right with her.
That friction seems to be really amplified by her parents.
Mm.
You have the father, Aubrey, and the mother, Tessa, and then the grandparents, the pater and the mater. I love those names.
It's so Victorian, isn't it?
It really is.
Her grandfather, H.C. Burke, was a solicitor, and this relationship is really the engine of her early intellectual life. Mary was a bit of a tomboy, but she was also this very studious, serious kid, and she would sneak into his smoke room.
The smoke room. It just conjures up such a specific image, doesn't it? Pipe tobacco, leather-bound books, dark wood paneling.
Exactly, the whole thing. And in that room, he treated her like an equal. He didn't talk down to her. He would give her chocolates from a special cupboard, yes, but then he would talk about his cases. He'd talk about the law.
And this is where she first learned that the law wasn't just a set of rules to punish people.
Right. It was a mechanism for fairness, for justice. He was teaching her, without her even realizing it, the principles of natural justice.
Which contrasts so sharply with her mother's view of the world. Her mother, Tessa, sounds like a character from a Jane Austen novel.
She really does. Charming, social, knew absolutely everyone, but obsessed with status.
Obsessed. There's this recurring theme in the book where her mother talks about their Norman ancestry, the Burkes.
Yes. She would tell Mary and her brothers, "We are descended from the Normans and Charlemagne. We have a crest. We are special." It was this constant refrain.
And Mary just wasn't buying it.
Not at all. In fact, it actually repulsed her. She talks about the cognitive dissonance. On Sundays, they go to Mass and hear that everyone is equal in the eyes of God.
And then they come home, and her mother implies they're better than the neighbors because of some medieval bloodline.
And Mary was looking at the poverty in Ballina and thinking, if we're so special, why aren't we fixing this? What does this specialness even mean?
It's the classic teenager realizing the adults are hypocrites, but amplified by the social stratification of that time.
Absolutely. And that sense of hypocrisy, that questioning of authority, it gets her into a bit of trouble.
Well, we can't talk about her childhood without talking about the discipline in the house. It sounds like a house of very high expectations and, frankly, some bizarre punishments.
Oh, the rubber knife story?
The rubber knife. It's such a strange, specific detail.
Her father had this flexible toy rubber knife. And if the kids were acting up, and there were 5 of them, so it was a chaotic household, he would use it to smack their legs or their hands.
It sounds almost slapstick, but she says the kids were absolutely terrified of it.
They were. They would whisper, "Watch out," or "Dad will get the knife." It represents the kind of, the authoritarian nature of the household. You toe the line, you behave. But Mary had this incredible stubborn streak that you can see even at age 8 or 9.
The walk to Enniskron. I think this story is the Rosetta Stone for her entire personality.
I agree completely. It defines her agency. It explains everything that comes later.
To set the scene.
Okay. The setup is Mary and her brothers are just making a racket in the house. Her father is trying to relax after a long day. He just snaps. He sarcastically yells at her, "Go on out and take your brothers for a walk."
He just meant, get out of my sight for an hour.
Of course. But Mary, being Mary, is a literalist, and she's stubborn.
She takes it as a command and a challenge.
She takes it as her mission, and she marches those boys 8 miles to the seaside town of Enniskron. It took them hours. They were small children walking along these country roads.
She mentions they had to stop at a farmhouse to beg for water.
They did. And when they get there, she doesn't just turn around. She needs proof.
This is the best part.
She put sand in her pockets. She needed physical evidence that she had completed the task. Then she finds a phone box and calls her father. "We are in Enniskron."
I can only imagine his face. The mix of horror and maybe a bit of pride.
I think just stunned silence. He drove out to pick them up, and she says the car ride home was in total silence. He didn't punish them. I think he realized that this daughter of his had a will of iron. If you gave her a direction, she would follow it to its absolute, logical, and extreme conclusion.
That stubbornness, that refusal to back down. It eventually leads to her being sent away. Because in 1961, climbing a tree was apparently a revolutionary act.
It seems so ridiculous now, doesn't it?
Complete.
She was a teenager, climbing a tree at her grandfather's house. Her grandfather saw her, waved his stick, and shouted, "You have to be sent away to school. You are not becoming a young lady."
The fear was that she was becoming too wild, too unrefined, not debutante material.
So the solution is Paris, a finishing school. The goal is to turn her into this docile, elegant, marriageable young woman.
Which was, I think we can say, a spectacular backfire.
A total backfire. Paris in the early 60s was not a place to become docile. It was a place of intellectual explosion.
When she lands in this convent, and the very first culture shock is the wine.
It broke the spell of Irish rigidity. In Ireland, she was a pioneer. She had taken a pledge against drinking alcohol until she was an adult.
A very common thing for Irish teenagers then.
Very common, and in Paris, the nuns are pouring wine at dinner. It was this small thing that signaled to her that the rules she grew up with were not universal laws. They were just local customs. And if that rule was arbitrary, well...
What else was arbitrary?
Exactly. It opens the floodgates. She starts reading the dangerous books, Sartre, Camus, Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex.
That must have been like a bomb going off in her mind.
It was. She encounters existentialism and feminism for the first time, and she starts asking the questions that were simply unaskable in Bellina. Why do women have to wear veils in church? Why are there no female priests? Why is the entire structure of her faith built on the exclusion of women?
She mentions returning to Ireland and feeling like a stranger in her own home. She says she came back not as a debutante, but as a questioning intellectual.
That must have been a nightmare for her parents.
I can imagine.
It was difficult. She clashed with them over religion. She stopped going to mass for a while, which in 1960s Ireland was just a nuclear option. It brought shame on the family. But she was setting the pattern for her life. She would rather be right and alone than wrong and part of the crowd.
That path leads her to Trinity College, Dublin, a Protestant university, which was another rebellious choice for a Catholic girl.
Another black mark against her from the church's perspective.
And then to a year that I think is arguably the most important in her political development, Harvard, 1967 to 68.
You cannot overstate the impact of Harvard. It's a seismic event in her life. She arrives in America during one of the most volatile, transformative years in U.S. history.
It's the peak of the counterculture.
It's the peak of the anti-Vietnam protests. The civil rights movement is at this critical, painful juncture.
Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated while she is there.
Right in the middle of her academic year, she witnesses the national grief, the riots. She sees students occupying university buildings. But more importantly, from a professional standpoint, she sees the law being used as a tool for social change.
In a way, it hadn't been in Ireland.
Not at all. In Ireland, the law was static. It was about maintaining order, preserving the status quo. In America, she saw that lawyers were activists. They were using the Constitution to force the government to treat people equally. It was a dynamic, living thing.
And she starts connecting the dots, doesn't she, between the Black civil rights movement in America
and the Catholic civil rights movement just beginning in Northern Ireland, and the undeclared civil rights movement for women in the Republic of Ireland.
You realize the dynamics were the same.
Exactly. A structural oppression supported by bad laws. And she had this epiphany. If you could change the laws, you could break the oppression. She basically decided to bring that American model of legal activism back to Dublin with her.
So she returns, totally fired up. She becomes a barrister. She's appointed Reed Professor of Law at Trinity. And then she's elected to the Senate at the incredibly young age of 25.
An amazing ascent.
But before we get into the huge legal battles she fights in the Senate, we have to talk about the personal battle she was fighting at the same time. Because this really humanizes her. She falls in love with Nick Robinson.
And this is where that famous maxim, the personal is political, becomes very, very literal for her.
Because Nick was a cartoonist, he was a liberal, and crucially,
he was a Protestant.
And we have to remind our listeners, especially those not familiar with Irish history, a mixed marriage in 1970 wasn't just a difference of opinion over where you go on a Sunday.
Oh, no. It was a massive societal taboo. It was seen as a betrayal of your tribe. The Catholic Church had these incredibly strict rules about mixed marriages, often requiring the non-Catholic partner to promise to raise the children Catholic.
It was the fault line that split the entire country.
It was, and her parents were devastated. They believed she was ruining her life, losing her faith, and, damaging their social standing in Ballina.
And they boycotted the wedding.
They did. They refused to attend.
That scene in the book is just heartbreaking. She's getting ready with her friend, the poet Evan Boland, and her father isn't there to walk her down the aisle. It's just her and her friend.
A judge friend had to step in at the last minute to give her away, and it highlights the immense personal price she paid for her convictions. This wasn't an abstract legal argument for her. She didn't just fight the church in the courts. She fought it in her own living room with her own family.
She loved her parents, but she refused to let their prejudice dictate who she could love and who she could marry.
They did reconcile eventually, which is a lovely part of the story, but that steel she forged in her personal life, that experience of standing up to her own father, her own family, that seems to be what allowed her to stand up to the state.
Because once she starts her legal career in the Senate, she goes after the biggest targets imaginable.
She becomes a constitutional crusader, and her biggest, most controversial target was the ban on contraception.
The McGee case.
Yes, Mary McGee. She was a woman from a small fishing community. She had 4 children and had faced really serious medical complications in her pregnancies. A stroke, temporary paralysis. Her doctor told her another pregnancy could literally kill her.
But in Ireland at the time, buying or importing contraceptives was illegal. Customs would seize them at the border.
It was an insane situation. So Robinson takes the case. But she didn't just argue women should have access to birth control. Her legal strategy was much more clever, much more subtle than that.
This is where the Harvard training kicks in, isn't it?
Absolutely. She looked at U.S. precedents, specifically Griswold v. Connecticut, which established a right to privacy within marriage. The Irish Constitution has this very strong language protecting the family. Now, conservatives always use that to say the family means no divorce, no contraception, a traditional structure.
She flipped it.
She flipped it completely. She argued that protecting the family actually meant the state had no business entering the marital bedroom and telling a couple what they could or could not do. It was a right to privacy.
That is brilliant legal jujitsu. Using the conservative value of family privacy to secure a liberal outcome.
It was genius. And it worked. The Supreme Court, to the shock of many, ruled that the ban was unconstitutional because it violated the privacy of the family unit.
It was a landmark victory. But winning in court didn't mean she was popular on the street.
Oh, she was vilified. Denounced from the pulpit as a heretic, nuns would literally cross the street to avoid her. She got hate mail calling her a murderer and a whore, but she didn't blink.
She just kept going.
She kept going. She fought for the right of women to sit on juries.
Which seems insane today that they couldn't.
Well, technically they could, but they had to actively apply to be on the list, whereas men were automatically on it. So de facto, juries were all male.
So not a jury of your peers if you're a woman.
Robinson argued exactly that. It denied defendants a jury of their peers. She just systematically, case by case, dismantled the legal structures of patriarchy.
And it all stemmed from this attitude she was fighting. She tells a funny story about her time in law school that just sums it all up. The boat race.
The just for women manner.
That's so petty.
And so revealing.
It is. She and 3 female friends entered a university boat race. The male students stood on the riverbank holding a huge sign that said, "Just for women." It was a play on a popular thriller at the time called The 4 Just Men.
But the intent was clear.
The intent was clear. You are just women. You are less than. Go home.
But she didn't go home. She went to the Senate. She went to the bar. And then, in 1990, after 2 decades of this work, she decides to go for the big one, the presidency of Ireland. And this is the real pivot point in the book. Up until 1990, the Irish presidency was, for all intents and purposes, a retirement home.
A nice house in the park.
A nice house in the park. It was a ceremonial role for elderly male politicians from the dominant political party, Fianna Fáil. You cut ribbons, you shook hands, you signed laws, and you kept your mouth shut.
And the Labour Party, a much smaller party, approaches Mary Robinson. What were the odds?
Laughable. The bookmakers had her at 100 to 1. Think about it. She was a woman in a deeply patriarchal society. She was a socialist in a conservative society. She was the liberal who brought contraception to Ireland in a deeply Catholic society. On paper, she was completely unelectable.
But she ran a different kind of campaign. She had the bus.
The campaign bus was revolutionary in Irish politics. She didn't just stay in Dublin and talk to journalists. She went to the rural towns, the small villages. And she played Simon and Garfunkel's Mrs. Robinson over the loudspeakers.
Here's to you, Mrs. Robinson. I mean, it's just perfect branding.
It was genius. But she also had to undergo this personal transformation. Robinson was an academic lawyer. She wasn't a fashion plate. She's very frank in the book that she had to learn how to dress. She had to get a makeover.
Some people might see that as selling out, but she saw it as removing barriers.
Right.
So people would listen to her.
Exactly. She realized that if she looked dowdy or severe, people would focus on her appearance instead of her words. She treated the clothes as a uniform for the job. She needed to look presidential to be seen as a credible president.
So the campaign is gathering this incredible grassroots momentum, but then comes the mistake that changed everything. The smear campaign by a politician named Padraig Flynn, We have to dissect this because it really explains why she won.
It's a textbook case of a political attack backfiring spectacularly. Padraig Flynn was a senior minister in the opposing party. He goes on a very popular national radio show, Saturday View, and he decides to attack her.
But he doesn't attack her policies. He attacks her womanhood.
He does. He said she was a career woman who was pretending to be a good wife and mother, that she had a newfound interest in family. He was basically accusing her of faking her identity as a woman to get votes. He was trying to use the bad mother trope against her.
He thought he was playing to the conservative rural base.
He thought he was hitting a home run. Instead, he struck a nerve that just exploded in his face. The women of Ireland, traditional housewives, rural women, women who had never voted Labour in their lives, they heard that tone. They recognized it instantly.
It was the tone of the husband who puts you down.
The priest who lectures you, the boss who dismisses you, it was pure condescension.
So it wasn't just an attack on Mary Robinson, it felt like an attack on them.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It galvanized the female vote in a way nothing else could have. They flocked to her, and she won.
And that victory speech, the phrase, "Nana-Harian."
The women of Ireland. She stood on the steps of Dublin Castle and said, instead of rocking the cradle, women rocked the system. It was electric. It was this moment where it felt like the old Ireland, the Ireland of the rubber knife and the Just for Women banner, was finally actually gone.
And she immediately sets about changing the symbolism of the office. The light in the window. This is such a simple but poignant image.
It connects to the deep trauma of emigration in Ireland. For generations, Ireland's biggest export was its people. Everyone had a brother in Boston, a sister in London, an aunt in Sydney, but the state itself often ignored them once they'd left.
They were gone.
They were gone. Robinson put a lamp in a window of Arras and Auchterrain, the president's house, and she kept it lit continuously, visible to the public. It was a beacon to the global Irish diaspora. She was saying, you are still part of this family. This light is on for you.
It made the presidency a place of emotional connection, not just cold bureaucracy.
That's it. But she didn't just do the emotional, symbolic stuff. She did the hard political work, particularly regarding Northern Ireland. She did something that was considered incredibly dangerous, even taboo at the time. She shook Gerry Adams' hand.
And we have to be clear, this was seismic. Gerry Adams was the leader of Sinn Féin, the political wing of the IRA.
The IRA was still active. The Troubles were still raging. Violence was still happening almost daily.
The British government was furious. The Irish government was extremely nervous.
They were. But Robinson's argument was rooted in her everybody matters philosophy. She said, I am the president of everyone on this island, by birthright. I cannot ignore a significant portion of the population just because I, or my government, disagree with their methods.
She was creating a space for dialogue where none existed.
That's exactly what she called it. She talked about the fifth province. Ireland has 4 geographical provinces. The fifth province, she said, is an imagined space, a mental space, a space of the mind where we can set down our historical weapons and meet as human beings.
And by shaking his hand, by visiting community groups in Belfast on both sides of the divide, she was using her soft power to prepare the ground for the peace process that followed a few years later.
She made the unthinkable thinkable. She made dialogue possible.
It's amazing to think that the role that was purely ceremonial became the spearhead for peace. But then, true to form, just when she's at the height of her popularity, she doesn't stay comfortable. She leaves.
She resigns a few months early from the presidency.
To take what might be the hardest, most thankless job in the world. UN High Commissioner for Human Rights.
It was a massive transition, and she captures the shock of it perfectly with the elevator moment.
I love this story because it's so small and so relatable, but it says everything.
So she's at the UN in New York or Geneva, I can't recall which. She walks into an elevator, and she just stands there. The doors close, and nothing happens. She's just waiting.
Because for 7 years as president of Ireland, a relentless stream of aides and security personnel had pushed every button for her.
Exactly. Doors opened by magic. Cars appeared from nowhere. Now, she was a UN official. She had to push her own button. And she said it was this tiny, funny moment of realization.
It was a metaphor for the work ahead. The pomp and circumstance were gone. It was just her and the button.
And the work. My God, the work was grim. The book takes a very dark turn here. We move from the hope and celebration of the Irish presidency to the absolute horror of Rwanda and Somalia.
This is the section she calls bearing witness.
A powerful phrase. She goes to Rwanda in the immediate aftermath of the genocide. She goes to Somalia during a catastrophic famine, and she describes walking through these camps where people are literally dying of cholera and starvation right in front of her.
It wasn't just observing, it was absorbing the trauma. There's a moment in the book where she tries to read a poem at Yale University and she just cracks.
I remember that passage so clearly. It's a poem by the Irish poet Derek Manhone, A Disused Shed in Collie, Wexford. And the lines are about lost, forgotten things, forgotten people, and they're crying out, save us now, save us from a world of nothing. And she says she just choked up. She couldn't finish it.
Because she was haunted.
She was haunted by the eyes of the people she had seen in those camps. And she channeled that trauma into a kind of a righteous anger. She got deeply frustrated with the UN way of doing things, the bland speeches.
The diplomatic speak.
She hated it, the delegation notes with concern or we call upon all parties. She refused to play that game. She started telling stories. She would go into the Security Council and instead of reading a dry report, she would tell them about a specific woman she met in a refugee camp in Sierra Leone. She forced these powerful men in suits to confront the human reality of their decisions.
She also picked fights. She didn't just criticize dictatorships in developing countries. She criticized the United States. She criticized China.
And that is a very risky thing to do as High Commissioner. You're supposed to be diplomatic. But Robinson saw her role not as a secretary for human rights, but as a general.
She clashed with Madeleine Albright, who was then the U.S. Secretary of State, over the death penalty in the U.S.
She did. She went to China and spoke about Tibet, which was unheard of. She believed that if human rights are truly universal, then the superpowers don't get a pass. You have to hold everyone to the same standard.
But the geopolitical tide turned against her. We have to talk about what she calls her darkest days, the Durban Conference, and then immediately after 9/11.
This was the absolute nadir of her time at the UN. The Durban Conference Against Racism in 2001 was supposed to be her masterpiece, a global agreement to tackle racism and the legacy of slavery.
It turned into a disaster.
A complete disaster. The language around Zionism in Israel became a toxic flashpoint. The U.S. and Israel walked out. The atmosphere was just poisonous.
And that conference ended on September 8th, 2001.
3 days later, the planes hit the Twin Towers. And Robinson says she knew in that instant that the human rights agenda she had fought for her entire life was in mortal danger.
Because the war on terror became the only game in town.
Exactly. Suddenly, governments all over the world were arguing that security trumped rights. Torture became enhanced interrogation. Indefinite detention became acceptable. She felt that all the work she had done, specifically the Durban Declaration Against Racism, was just, as she puts it, buried in the rubble of the World Trade Center. It was a devastating blow to her vision of the world.
It would have been so easy to quit then, to retire to Mayo and write her memoirs and tend her garden. But she didn't. She joined the Elders.
The Elders. It sounds like a council of wizards from Lord of the Rings, doesn't it?
It basically is. It's the Avengers of global diplomacy.
It was Nelson Mandela's brainchild. He had this idea to gather a group of independent global leaders, people like Robinson, Desmond Tutu, Jimmy Carter, Kofi Annan, people who held no political office, who didn't need to get reelected, so they could speak the unvarnished truth to power.
And she gives us some great, very humanizing glimpses of Mandela behind the scenes.
She does. She shows his playful side. He was a tease. He loved to tease her about her husband, Nick, calling him her boss. He had this mischievous spark, but when they got to work, they tackled the hardest taboos.
Like child marriage.
Yes. They would go into communities and challenge religious and traditional leaders who said that child marriage was our culture, our tradition. And the Elders would say, tradition cannot justify abuse. A child is a child.
And it's through this work, this global listening tour, that she comes to the final and perhaps most urgent chapter of her life, climate justice. Now, I have to say, I was surprised by this part of the book. She's very honest that she was late to the party on this.
It's a very honest admission. She says that for years she compartmentalized climate change. She thought it was an issue for scientists or environmentalists. It was about polar bears and ice caps. It wasn't a human rights issue to her.
So what was the aha moment? What shifted her perspective so dramatically?
It goes back to her core practice, listening. She was doing work in Africa and she kept hearing the same stories over and over again from women farmers. She mentions one woman in particular, Constance Okole from Uganda.
What did Constance tell her?
Constance wasn't talking about parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. She was saying the seasons are broken. She said, "When I was young, we knew when the first rains would come. We knew when to plant. Now the rains don't come, or they come all at once in a flood and destroy the harvest. We have no food."
And Robinson realized.
She realized that what these women were describing was a profound violation of their most basic rights: the right to food, the right to health, the right to life. And they hadn't caused the problem. Their communities have almost zero carbon footprint. But they were the ones starting.
That is the justice in climate justice. It's the fundamental inequity of impact.
That's it. It's not just bad weather, it's a global injustice where the rich countries pollute and the poor countries suffer the consequences. She noticed a linguistic pattern she calls the but pattern.
Huh.
Farmers would say to her, "We know how to farm. But the rules of nature have changed." Or, "We know how to find water. But the wells are dry." That but was the sound of their lives being upended by forces beyond their control.
And she also connects this to the future in a very personal way, through her grandson, Rory.
This is the intergenerational aspect that really hit home for her. When Rory was born in 2003, she had what she calls a time horizon shift. She suddenly started thinking about the year 2050. She realized that Rory would be in his 40s then.
And she started calculating, what kind of world will he be living in? Will it be habitable? Will there be enough food, enough water? It made the abstract science deeply, deeply personal.
It became about family, and she talks about granny power, too.
Yes. The troika of women leaders at climate conferences.
She argues that women, and specifically grandmothers, have a unique vantage point in this fight. They're the custodians of the future. They aren't just thinking about the next election cycle or the next fiscal quarter. They are thinking about the survival of the lineage.
So if we look at this entire incredible journey from the shy girl in Ballina to the global climate warrior, there are these two concepts that seem to tie it all together. You mentioned them, Maythiel and Ubuntu.
They're the philosophical anchors of the entire book, I think.
Yep.
Maythiel is an old Irish concept. It's a Gaelic word. It refers to a kind of work party neighbors coming together voluntarily to save a harvest. If a farmer was sick and couldn't bring in his potatoes, the neighbors would show up and dig them for him.
And it wasn't charity.
No, it was mutual survival. Because you knew next year you might be the one who was sick.
And Ubuntu.
Ubuntu is the beautiful African philosophy that she learned from Desmond Tutu. It's often translated as, "I am because you are. My humanity is inextricably caught up in yours. I cannot be fully safe if you are in danger. I cannot be truly happy if you are suffering."
And Robinson is essentially arguing that in the 21st century, in the age of climate change and pandemics, the whole world is one small village. We need a global Maythiel.
That is her argument, exactly. We are all on the same small rock. If we don't help our global neighbor dig the potatoes, or in this case, transition to green energy and protect human rights, then eventually we all starve.
It's an incredibly powerful message. And it brings us right back to the challenge that she poses to us, to the listener, to you.
She asks us to look at our own small places, the office where you work, the school where you study, the neighborhood where you live, and to ask, who is invisible there? Who is being silenced? Who isn't at the table?
And do you have the courage to be the one to speak up? You don't have to become the president of Ireland. You just have to be stubborn enough to take that 8-mile walk to Enniscrone.
We're just brave enough to put a light in the window for someone who feels left out to say, "You are welcome here."
That is the real challenge of Everybody Matters. It's not just a book to be read and put back on the shelf. It's a standard to try and live by.
And it requires action. It requires you to be a bit uncomfortable sometimes. To break a rule if the rule is fundamentally unjust. To cross a divide like she crossed that divide in Belfast to shake Jerry Adams's hand.
If you want to really understand the depth of these stories, and we've discussed a lot, but there's so much more detail and nuance in the text, you really need to buy this book. It is Everybody Matters, My Life-Giving Voice by Mary Robinson. It truly is a manual for the 21st century citizen.
I couldn't agree more. And if this episode has sparked an idea in you, if it's made you think of your own small place and what you could do, let us know. Engage with the author on social media, tag the podcast. We really want to hear how you are applying these ideas.
Yes, please do. And if you enjoyed this discussion, if it gave you something to think about, please subscribe to the Playing Books podcast. Share this episode with a friend who needs a bit of hope, or maybe just a little bit of a kick in the pants to get active.
And leave a review.
Oh, definitely leave us a review. It really does help us reach more people.
It helps us keep that light in the window burning, so to speak.
Beautifully put. Thank you so much for giving us your time today. We know it's valuable, and we appreciate you spending it with us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Remember, everybody matters. We'll see you next time.